In this very first episode, we ask, what is good about life? Is life about something other than the way it feels? Or does life all just ultimately boil down to pleasure? A very big welcome to Surprising Ethics, where we look at surprising ways philosophers are trying to turn the tables on received wisdom. We bring you the most interesting ethical and political discussions in contemporary philosophy. We explore the battle between the status quo and alternative ideas, and we always uncover a surprising take in each and every episode. I'm William Gilday, a researcher in McGill University's Department of Philosophy and at the Centre for Research in Ethics. And this podcast is kindly supported by the Centre for Research in Ethics, an academic research centre based in Montreal. This is the very first episode, so let me explain how each episode will be structured. So we'll look at the status quo about a given issue in ethics or political philosophy. We'll arrive at a conundrum which threatens to upset that status quo. Then we'll introduce an alternative idea which responds to that conundrum and let the battle between the status quo and the alternative play out. Sometimes maybe the alternative idea will win, other times the status quo might hold its own. But there's always going to be a surprising theory or a surprising argument to uncover. And that's the promise from me. Each episode will contain a surprise, some interesting, quirky, different idea. I'll be doing shorter episodes myself, with the help of voice clips from philosophers, celebrities, commentators, and I'll also be doing longer episodes interviewing philosophers to dig deeper into their very own contribution to these unfolding debates in ethics and political philosophy. Today we look at welfare, or what it means for a life to go well, and we look at the hedonist take on that question. We ask whether, for a life to be good, it must contain many different goods, or whether it all actually boils down to one thing, pleasure. To assess how well our lives are going, do we just add up all the pleasure and subtract the pain? Or do we need to look at other dimensions too? We're not today asking about a good life in the sense of being a good person, but rather we're asking about the nature of welfare, or what is ultimately good for someone. And I find this an exciting question because it can inform decisions about our lives and provide a kind of high-level benchmark for reflection on life. So to unpack the idea of welfare a bit more, suppose that you thought, look, I want to improve my life, and you sat down to write a list of things you wanted to do to make your life better. What would you personally put on that list? Okay, so maybe you wanted a holiday, or you wanted to travel to Nepal, or you wanted to see old friends more, or to make more time for painting. The question is, why are those things on the list, ultimately? Are these things on the list because they will increase your pleasure and reduce your pain? Or are there other ultimate aims besides the hedonic quality of your experience? Let's get into the status quo. So the status quo seems to be definitely against hedonism. So the first ever clip I'm playing you on this philosophy podcast is Cristiano Ronaldo.
I have millions, billions, but the most important thing is the family. Keep your family healthy, good, and take care of your family, because this is the most important thing in the world. Apart of that, of course, you have your life, your private life, you have your girlfriend, you have your cars, your houses, your fame. But in the beginning, your family, it's always with you, for the good moments and for the bad moments.
And now Cass Sunstein, a professor at Harvard Law School, talking on the Lives Well Lived podcast.
So these seem to be three ingredients of welfare. One is hedonic state in terms of smiles and tears. Another is a sense of meaning. So people will sacrifice something in the way of a joyful day for a sense that life is meaningful rather than meaningless. Also, people care a lot. We have data on this, on diversity of experience, so that people will sacrifice smiling for doing lots of different things. Not all the smiling will be lost for doing lots of different things, but some smiling will be lost. And people will actually sacrifice meaning for the sense of diversity.
So yeah, I think in the first clip, Ronaldo isn't really getting involved in the philosophical debate directly, I guess, but he's basically saying, look, these things which we associate with pleasure, wealth, his girlfriends, his cars, his homes in the plural, apparently, obviously, I guess, those aren't what really matters. The most important thing, what it really comes down to is family. Sure, other things can matter. Maybe he thinks that pleasure does have intrinsic value, but what we should really be focusing on is family and relationships like the family. So Ronaldo seems to hold a kind of pluralist view of welfare. And then Cass Sunstein was, I guess, giving us empirical evidence which suggests that people do have a kind of pluralist view of welfare. They think that subjective experience, meaning, and diversity of experiences have to be traded off against each other. So which would imply, I think, that each of them makes a distinctive contribution to welfare. It's not all about subjective experience. Okay, so we now arrive at our conundrum. We might gravitate towards the idea that there's a plurality of things that make a life better and think that pleasure is a reductive approach. But all the other things on the list of constituents of welfare are also pleasurable. Isn't the self-focused reason to aim for good relationships or a diversity of experiences just that we'd be sad, bored, or depressed even without those things? In other words, doesn't it still all come down to pleasure and pain? Hedonism says, yes, it does. Hedonism challenges the status quo and says, look, it's all ultimately about pleasure. Sure, relationships are part of a good life for most of us. Sure, meaning or achievement are also normally part of what makes a good life. But the question is why? Why are those things part of a good life? The hedonist says, our answer is pleasure and less suffering. And that's it. Meaning, achievement, relationships, these things don't in themselves make our lives go better. And when they do make our lives go better, it's because they are enjoyable, or it's because they mitigate suffering. So here are two quick distinctions to get a slightly clearer picture of hedonism. So firstly, hedonism is to be distinguished from psychological hedonism, the claim that the only motivation human beings ever have is their own pleasure or pain. So hedonism, as we're looking at it, isn't a descriptive claim about what motivates humans in reality. It's an evaluative claim about what has value. And it's consistent with thinking that human beings really do act out of ethical motivations some of the time. Secondly, hedonists aren't egoists, or not normally. That is, they're not arguing that one's own pleasure is all one has reason to care about. They're just saying that each individual's life goes well to the extent that it has net pleasure. And that's consistent with thinking that we have ethical obligations to help others feel more pleasure and less pain. Hedonism sounds bodily, it sounds base, but hedonists don't mean to exclude mental pleasures. So pleasure can encompass any mental state that feels good, like delight, elation, contentment, gratitude, loving feelings, and so on. Even intellectual and aesthetic pleasures, and many hedonists are actually really interested in these intellectual pleasures. So John Stuart Mill famously distinguished between higher and lower pleasures. But less well known is that Francis Hutcheson had a fourfold hierarchy of pleasures that he proposed several decades before Mill. He actually thought that religious pleasures were at the very top of the list. They were the pinnacle of the highest quality of pleasure. And that's obviously quite the inverse of the stereotype of hedonism as being all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Here's where the status quo tries to really land a hammer blow against hedonism. And I'm going to give a variant of the experience machine argument originally advanced by the Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974. The variant I'm going to explain is offered by Eden Lin, a contemporary philosopher working at Ohio State University. So Lin says, imagine two lives that feel exactly the same from the inside. So as far as Adam and Bill are concerned, they wake up in the morning at 5 Riverside Drive, say, next to their partner, and they cycle for 14 minutes by the river down to, say, York Avenue, to their job as a scientist, and so on and so forth. As far as they're concerned, their lives seem identical. They are living the same life from an internal perspective. Every jolt of fear, every drop of pleasure they experience is the same. What they're seeing on a given second, on a morning, on the 15th of March, 2005, everything is the same. But here's the difference. Adam's life unfolds in the real world. His partner is real. His job is real. His research is real. His friends are made out of flesh and blood and brains. They are real. Bill's life feels completely real. You cannot tell it's not a real life, but it is a simulation. He is in an experience machine. His parents died, his mother died in childbirth, and he was, for his own good, say, plugged into the most high-tech experience simulator you could imagine, designed to copy Adam's life. His eyes are closed. In real life, he's sitting on a stool in what looks like a photo booth. He's being played these experiences through electrodes that are plugged into his brain. But from the inside, what goes on in front of his eyes seems to be exactly the same as Adam and his real life. Lin asks this question: whose life is better for them? Whose life is higher in welfare? What do you think? Many people seem to think Adam's life, the real life, is better for him than Bill's life is for Bill. But hedonism, because it focuses only on pleasures and pains, must say that they are equally high in welfare. All the pleasures, all the pains, all the gaps in the middle are identical. And so hedonism gives us the wrong result. It counterintuitively says these lives are the same in terms of welfare, when they just don't seem to be. And I think this is kind of a surprising argument, not just because of the kind of creative details that are based on Nozick's original thought experiment, but also because we're often so caught up in our experiences day to day. It's all we seem to care about in a given hour or minute or day. How much pain are we feeling? How much frustration? How much suffering? How much relief or enjoyment are we experiencing? But this argument shows us that so much more matters to us than what we just experience, merely what our lives seem to be like to us from the inside. We do want, as Nozick suggests, contact with reality. We do want meaning in our lives and achievement, or we want to actually be a certain type of person. We actually want to touch our partners on the shoulder and be there for them, rather than just the impression that that's what's happening to us. We actually want to celebrate our friend's birthday, rather than just hallucinating almost the experience. We care about a lot more, even when we're staying within the confines of our self-interest, not even to mention morality and fulfilling our duties. So how can the hedonist respond? So here's something that Roger Crisp says, and Crisp is one of the foremost contemporary defenders of hedonism. So Crisp asks us to imagine versions of relationships or achievements that produce not a single drop of pleasure at any time. Surely, he thinks, these things don't make our lives go better. So mightn't that mean that only pleasure makes our lives go well? So we're to imagine here having a relationship that perhaps, while it exemplifies mutual care or mutual respect, mutual understanding, doesn't produce any pleasure. The interactions in that relationship, the memories of that relationship, none of it produces any enjoyment whatsoever. Or maybe it's easier to imagine Dostoevsky writing Crime and Punishment, and it's this incredible novel, but he's depressive and feels no pleasure writing it, no pleasure when it comes out, and no pleasure remembering writing it. Crisp also points out that once we realise how vital good relationships or achievements are for our happiness, and we might add, once we vividly imagine how great our experienced relationships would be in the experience machine, the view that relationships are independent contributors to welfare might have less momentum behind it. And we can back that point up with some impressive empirical data on just how important relationships are for having enjoyable lives. So there's a study which started in 1938 during the Great Depression and tracked people. Some were Harvard alumni, others were inner city Boston residents. And it tracked their happiness and their health and asked what makes a happy life. So here's Robert Waldinger, the current leader of the Harvard study of adult development.
The clearest message that we get from this 75-year study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. We've learned 3 big lessons about relationships. The first is that social connections are really good for us and that loneliness kills. It turns out that people who are more socially connected to family, to friends, to community are happier, they're physically healthier, and they live longer than people who are less well connected. And the experience of loneliness turns out to be toxic. People who are more isolated than they want to be from others find that they are less happy, their health declines earlier in midlife, their brain functioning declines sooner, and they live shorter lives than people who are not lonely.
Okay, so let's summarise how a hedonist might fight back against the experience machine. They might say, well, look, if you imagine relationships or achievements that produce not a single drop of pleasure, do you really think that they're good for you? And if it seems not, then hedonism has a simple and attractive explanation of why, which is that only pleasurable things are ultimately good for us. Secondly, once we properly appreciate just how vital things like good relationships are for happiness, we can see that it's no wonder we want to put them on a pedestal and claim them as independent contributors to a good life. But really, they're just incredible ingredients in pleasure and incredibly good insulators against suffering. Okay, so how can the defender of the status quo respond to the hedonist? They might say, well, look, the fact that relationships are found scientifically to be so critical for happiness doesn't actually show that happiness is the only reason they're valuable. It could still be the case, right, that relationships, as well as being great producers of happiness, are valuable independently of that. And as for the thought experiment with the pleasureless versions of relationships or achievements, we might say, okay, we agree that it's not beneficial for our lives to have a relationship that's completely pleasureless. But that's not because hedonism is right. It's not because nothing devoid of pleasure can possibly contribute to my well-being. It's because relationships without pleasure are bad as relationships. And therefore they have no independent value for that reason. They're kind of failed examples of relationships. Aristotle said that proper friendship has to benefit us, or it's not really a proper friendship after all. It would be strange to have a friend who one never wants to see, with whom one never has an enjoyable time. That wouldn't really be a friend anymore. But relationships of quality, relationships that are non-alienating, are basic contributors to our welfare and are not reducible to pleasure or tools against suffering. So, do you think the experience machine is the fatal blow against hedonism many people take it to be? I looked up a survey of professional philosophers. It's called the Phil Papers Survey. And according to the most recent version of that survey, how many philosophers are hedonists? 12.7%. I think a lot of that comes down to the experience machine. But we might just think that the experience machine only highlights one piece of evidence against hedonism. We might think our intuitions are off, that we're so attached to the idea of reality and having an impact on reality that we can't really let go of the idea that it's all ultimately just about our experiences and, of course, the experiences of others. These are questions we won't discuss here, but we can just end on this note. Maybe we can draw some comfort from a deeper interrogation of hedonism and its critics. It's very hard to take sides. It's very hard to say hedonism is right or hedonism is wrong. But what we can, I think, say is that thinking about ultimate values gets into perspective the value or the lack of value of money, of social status, of popularity, and so on. No one in philosophy is defending the idea that any of those things matter in themselves. If I remember correctly, I think Aristotle dismisses the idea that money matters in itself within about a sentence. And the Harvard psychologists seem to have found anyway that money and fame are not very good generators of happiness either. And in the midst of anxieties about whether we have the status that we associate with money, whether we have the standing that achievement seems to bring, whether we have the social popularity that would make us feel better about ourselves, this, I think, can be a blessed relief, to realise that our lives are not, at least ultimately, about those things at all. They're about something else, whether that's pleasure or meaningful relationships or meaningful projects. And I will leave those questions with you. Thank you so much for tuning in to this first ever episode, and join me next time for more surprising ethics.